My HS 103 students, this is your Professor Donald Earl Collins, and it's now week 8. We're now into the second half of the semester. There's a lot going on the next couple of weeks. Um, I just want to go through all that and briefly give you an overview of what we're supposed to cover this week. Um, and that several things. Number one, thanks to all of you who got in your um, final drafts of your writing assignment, of your essays on time, more or less. Um, I'm following the spirit of the rule, not literally the letter. For everyone who submitted as a draft and not in the correct slot, I still have access to it, so there was no need to go back in and resubmit for grading purposes. So anyone who was able to get at least a draft in for that I have access to before 11:59 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, you are officially on time according to the spirit of the rule, and therefore not subject to 11-point deduction in your grade on your on your essay. There are folks who submit it as PDFs who will lose a few points. They won't lose 11 points, but you will lose a few points for doing that. There are those who did not submit on time at all, not even in draft form, and they are losing 11 points for those purposes as well. And there are those who have extensions, and if they don't meet their extension deadlines, will lose at least 11 points too. And for those who have extensions and don't meet the 1 week deadline, or lose 11 points and don't meet the 1 week deadline, will lose all points and not end up with a 0 on this assignment. So if you have a essay that you haven't submitted yet and you don't have an extension or any real excuse for getting it in, please get it in, because losing 11 points is a lot better than losing 100 points. So there's that. You have a proposal due this week based on the freestyle assignment project that you're supposed to be doing that's due on December the 4th toward the end of the semester. It's basically a presentation of material based on an artifact that you have analyzed, taken apart, put back together, for the purposes of understanding some aspect of U.S. history, some aspect of an event, or what have you. It can be from an amendment to the UN Declaration of Human Rights and U.S. participation in it, and how that could impact the U.S. Constitution. It could be um, America the Beautiful as a song, could be any number of things, right? But it has to be an artifact that either is from the present and you can relate to some aspect of the past in some specific way, or something actually out of the past that has historical significance to either you as an individual or your group. And being creative, making it more personal or personable is what I'm asking folks to do with this. So, for example, um, I'm being very silly about this, but not really. There's a song called Tainted Love by Soft Cell from the early 1980s. There's a line in it that goes, "Once I ran to you, now I run from you." For years, I've basically sang it as "Once I ran to you, now I rack from you," as in Iran and Iraq, and relating it to U.S. involvement in the Middle East. You could literally do that. You can rewrite lyrics to a song to indicate, some sort of historical significance to a series of events. You can do that. You can write new lyrics. You can write a song altogether that's based on, you know, lines from the Watergate crisis, or lines from the Iran-Contra crisis, or lines from the war on drugs, or what have you. You can do that. That's just one of many examples of what you can do. It's pretty expansive. The definition of an artifact is somewhat expansive too, but it has to be, again, just like with your writing assignment, it has to be relatable to a historical event or historical trend, or something along those lines, right? It's easier, of course, if you have something that is a historical document to work with, right? For example, you could talk about the inaugural address of JFK in 1961. Um, Challenging folks, ask not what you do for what your country can do for you, what you can do for your country is one example of that. It's not the only one. I mean, there are lots of examples. My main point here is that you have this week to try to figure out if you're going to be part of a group, if you're going to do this individually, what your artifact will be, how you plan on going about it. Are you going to sing, write rap lyrics, write some poetry, just do general analysis, do a podcast, do a round robin interview or debate. I mean, and that you record, you know, do man on the street kinds of things. I don't know, something that is creative in nature but yet relates to the history of whatever you want to cover. It can even be personal. It could be a picture, from your a family heirloom. It relates to some other event from the past. That's still an artifact. Artifact is literally anything that, you know, has some tangible, relate you have some tangible relationship to that has that you can turn into an understanding of a certain aspect of U.S. history. So that's really all I'm asking. It's pretty expansive, and I want you to be creative with it, especially in groups. As individuals, you don't have to be as creative because it's just you, right? But if you've got a group of four, you should be able to come up with something pretty good. So there's that. What else is going on? We're doing Zoom this week. We're doing Zoom this Tuesday. All my classes will be on Zoom for at least 40 minutes. Hopefully, the Zoom folks won't be, literally shutting us off at 40 minutes and 1 second. I'm hoping to do an hour. Or the subscription that institutions have at this point are 40 minutes because no one wants to spend the money to update Zoom, and I know most of you don't have Microsoft Teams, so I'm not going to use Teams when I know most people have access to Zoom. And I'm doing this for a variety of reasons, but mostly because of low attendance in some of my classes. Most of my classes, as a matter of fact. Not every class is low attendance, but most classes, for the most part, have had some low attendance issues over the course of the last 4 weeks. And so I want to see if this helps with attendance with people showing up, particularly for people who've been ill and chronically ill over the past month. So we are doing Zoom for Tuesday, October the 25th. We might do Zoom again next week, depending on the response to Zoom. We'll be in person in between on the 27th of October and probably on November 1st as well. We'll see what happens with this. So I've already sent out an email with links for people to show up at their appropriate times. Please use the links and the passwords to get on. I will let you on as things permit. If you get mixed up and you come to the wrong time, I will still let you in because you are, after all, one of my students. So that as long as it's the class that you're supposed to be in there for, I mean, if you're in another class that's not related to this one, you're not getting in. So there's that. So this week, I'll just spend a few minutes on it since we are doing Zoom tomorrow as well as I'm teaching in person on Thursday. I want to spend a little bit of time on what the main topic for this week is, which is the 1950s. Um, the glorious decade, the rise of the American century and middle class, where Americans go from essentially being predominantly working class and working poor to predominantly middle class, whether in blue collar work or white collar work during the course of the 1950s. By 1960, approximately 60-61% of the population is middle class, not considering themselves middle class according to Pew polls, but actually literally making enough money to afford a house, afford a car or more, to be able to put their kids through college because it's mostly paid for by the state, those kinds of things, right? It's a great decade where poverty is considered wiped out and doesn't even really exist. But what underlies this decade is a lot of issues around, pseudo-fascist elements within American society, certain elements in terms of conformity, the Cold War, and with the Cold War and the rise of the Soviet Union as a nuclear power, not just a superpower, but a nuclear superpower along with the U.S., the fear of not only invasion from the Soviet Union, but of annihilation from the Soviet Union. The space race that starts in the midst of the 1950s is really a race, is an arms race, which, the more peaceful version of is let's see if we can get someone launched into space and then eventually to the moon, right? That's the peaceful part of it. The not so peaceful part of it are proxy wars like the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the infiltration of Soviet forces in Hungary in 1956, the threat of Soviet invasion of Turkey in the 1950s and early 1960s, U.S. interventions in Guatemala, in the Suez Canal, and other places throughout in Iran in the 1950s as well. So both sides in this particular case are intervening on, in those ways. So, but the biggest element that I'll cover for class purposes this week, I'll cover other pieces too, but the biggest element in terms of the 1950s I'll cover for this week is the Red Scare, is McCarthyism and what comes with that. And the thing to think about regarding the Red Scare is that it didn't have to be this way, but it ended up this way anyway. When you are, you know, under the constant surveillance of the world as the world's arsenal for democracy, the leader of the free world, as Winston Churchill passes the baton to Harry Truman in March of 1946. Some of you saw that the recording for that. Others of you, I didn't have enough time to do it, so you at least got the quotes from it about an Iron Curtain has descended upon Europe, that sort of thing. The result of all of these things happening in the early part of the Cold War was the Red Scare, and Eugene McCarthy takes advantage of all that. You know what? I always mix this up. It's Joseph McCarthy mixes all of that up. Eugene McCarthy also happens to be a senator from Minnesota, but is a Democrat, and quite frankly, is you know, it's a different kind of Democrat than Joseph McCarthy. Joseph McCarthy was basically a person who took advantage of the situation regarding the Red Scare, regarding the government's fear of espionage and domestic terrorism on behalf of folks who were working on behalf of the Communist Party, Soviet Union, the Socialist parties, and other parties, USA, and took a lot of their fear, their anger toward having to be in the arms race with the Soviet Union, proxy wars with the Soviet Union via the Korean War, and so on, out on the American populace, particularly the populace that was center left or even solidly left. McCarthy took advantage through the House Un-American Activities Committee. I got asked a question about this when I was a graduate student by my professor saying, "Are you sure?" Because McCarthy was a senator. He couldn't have possibly been a part. Yeah, actually, he was. He had been granted unusual dispensation as somebody who was highlighting, how many people could have been part of the Department of Defense or the Department of the Army who he considered to be potential threats, right, because of their past affiliations, which oftentimes he was just making up. So HUAC, which had been around since 1938, HUAC, or the House Un-American Activities Committee, often had them on the panels, and he would interrogate people, individuals, groups, entire groups, as far as their un-American activities, in this case communist or socialist activities. Actors. Lucille Ball at one point, the star of her own show, I Love Lucy, in the 1950s. The first real, that and The Honeymooners, the first two real popular shows in television history, and hers was immensely popular. Was hauled in because in the 1930s she had been gone to a few Socialist Party USA meetings, and in fact had been at one point a card-carrying member of the Socialist Party USA, right in the 1930s when things were really bad and there was something called the Great Depression going on. Now people are being hauled in for their past activities. School teachers, folks who are part of the Manhattan Project in Los Alamos and other parts of the country. Um, Social rights and human rights and civil rights activist Paul Robeson, W.E.B. Du Bois, had his passport taken away from him for 8 years because of his writings with the Crisis magazine when he was working for the NAACP up in New York City in the 1930s and 40s, among other people. So many people hauled in, thousands of people who lost their livelihoods because they were compromised. Some of these people lost their livelihoods because they were bohemian, because they were gay and in the closet, and considered threats because of potential to be blackmailed. But instead of being blackmailed, they were blackballed. They were literally not only lost their jobs, they couldn't find a job in their field at all. Paul Robeson lost his career as an actor in no small part because of his activities as a civil rights activist, among other people. So this went on for a number of years. It wasn't until 1954, during Eisenhower administration, when HUAC and specifically McCarthy was hauling an army generals and officials, army officers, people who'd been part of the Civil War, who'd won Bronze Stars and Silver Stars and Purple Hearts, and accusing them of having engaged in un-American activities. And when finally someone on the panel, someone in the Senate finally says to them, "Have you no shame? Have you no shame? Are you willing to just go after anybody for any reason whatsoever because you don't like them, because they're just making stuff up?" So finally, he's voted out of office, and within 2 years he dies from, like 2 or 3 years after this, he dies from cirrhosis of the liver because he was also a raging alcoholic, among other things. So, but HUAC's activities continue whether he's there or not. Throughout the 1950s, people are being hauled in because civil servants, everyday people, because they're in the closet, they're gay, they're lesbian, they're transgender, whatever. They're civil rights activists, they're bohemians. They, once read Das Kapital. They checked it out of the library. They read Catcher in the Rye. All of these things were going on throughout the 1950s. This is the ugly side of the 50s. This is the ugly side of the Red Scare. There are movies coming out called The Russians Are Coming in 1954 about the threat of the Soviet invasion, invading the U.S. And then later in the 1950s, especially after the Soviet Union launches Sputnik and puts a satellite in orbit around the world in 1957, that's a signal for the U.S. to escalate army in rocketry so that we can miniaturize more and more stuff so that we can take an atomic weapon, in particular a thermonuclear weapon. The U.S. tests the first thermonuclear weapons, nuclear weapons that use fission, that in the heat of fission, to create an uncontrollable nuclear fusion reaction, so that you can basically melt an entire city in a matter of seconds, that kind of stuff. And so instead of producing thousands of tons of TNT equivalents in an atomic explosion, you can produce millions of tons of TNT with an atomic explosion. So factors by several thousand. So, they're trying to miniaturize this stuff, put it on platforms, on missile platforms, or what are known as intercontinental ballistic missiles, so you can launch them at the Soviet Union instead of launching a whole bunch of B-52 bombers, these, supersonic jet bombers that would still take hours to fly halfway around the world to bomb Moscow or other parts of the Soviet Union. Instead, you can put it on a missile that goes at hypersonic speeds and ends up dropping the nuke, on a major city inside of 30 minutes, right? That kind of thing. And so part of that turns into a space race, but the space race technology comes out of the nuclear weapons program, the nuclear missile program. And the nuclear missile program comes about because of Operation Paperclip. Operation Paperclip is the U.S.'s own attempt to get a hold of German scientists and German technologies for its own advancement in terms of military-industrial complex, in terms of weaponry, right? And so that involves people like Werner von Braun, the head of the V1 and V2, particularly the V2 weapons testing programs organized by Nazi Germany toward the end of the war. Their whole miracle weapon program. He's the one who successfully launches V2s in 1944 and 45 on targets in London, Paris, Amsterdam, and other parts of Western Europe as the Germans are losing World War II. So they capture him and hundreds of other scientists and put them to use and develop the weaponry. But those, they developed the first ICBMs, to develop what becomes Trident missiles, becomes Titan 1 and Titan 2 missiles in the 1950s and 60s. Yes, I know this in a lot more detail than what you'll see in a textbook. I used to study this for a living. But the bigger thing that develops out of this eventually are the Saturn V rockets, the Saturn V rockets, the rockets that eventually launch Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin and company to the moon for a series of moon landings and moon orbits between 1968 and 1973. So there's that. And he's alive to see it all happen. He's alive to do it all. These people claim not to be Nazis, of course, but of course they very much are Nazis. We just wink at it and go, okay, we believe you're not Nazis, even though you use slave labor to develop the rocketry system that you used, known as V2 in the first place. But hey, It's okay, right? All's fair in potential for nuclear war and all. So, but that comes out of the 1950s too, right? So the 1950s is this interesting era. It's an era of supposedly more freedom, more prosperity, more of everything for every American than any Americans ever seen before. It's the rise of consumer culture. It's the rise of everything we understand to be normal today. All of our distractions in music, in sports, in television, in you know, in movies, and all of that. All of these distractions. But lest we forget, while all this is going on, there's a major government crackdown on people who are left of center. Anything to the left gets cracked down on, right? Anything to the right only gets cracked down if the U.S. is exposed as basically being contradictory, which comes out in the form of the Civil Rights Movement, which I'll talk about separately. It's got its own separate sort of thing in terms of the 1950s. But if we're talking specifically about America as a whole, not just African Americans and not just African Americans and obviously racist white people, right? Just America as a whole. Whites mostly, with African Americans and other groups mixed in. Then it's an era of prosperity, but with a lot of conformist sort of semi-fascist attitudes for people who refuse to conform going on. The Cold War and the Red Scare within that is a perfect opportunity for people to crack down on people who aren't normal, who are not part of the norm, who want to see a society that is not just a conformist society of consumerism and consumer capitalism, but a society that actually is equal for everyone. And so that's really the theme of this week, right? And what comes with it is the scare of and the potential for nuclear war, right? It's not really, it's all theoretical in the 1950s to be truthful. But in the 1960s, it's no longer theoretical. And because it's no longer theoretical, you see things like the Cuban Missile Crisis happen. And so I'll stop with that for this week.